Hello, welcome to another lap guide for the Camel GT series in iRacing. For week 7, we are at Canadian Tire Motorsports Park, aka Motorsport. So before we go into details, here's the lap. Okay, so just something a little different this week for this guide. This was actually my qualifying lap for the 2016 season. And I like this lap because I set a couple of personal bests in the lap, and when the pressure was on, I felt like I had to qualify well. This was a very strong strength of field. I was the number 11 car. This was a race that I actually went on to win, and it's actually one of the most memorable races that I've had in my iRacing career. So I wanted to use this for the guide. We have the same weather that we did for last season. It's late afternoon weather. The weather's a little on the cooler side here with 77 Fahrenheit track temp, but I have only made very minimal adjustments to the setup, a little bit of adjustments to the gearing specifically, and I'll talk about how that might differ a little bit from this lap, but pretty minor, and I'm putting about the same lap times in practice, or at least optimal. It's very, very difficult to get into the 103s without really nailing every aspect to it. So I'm going to talk about some key elements for this track and go over this here in the guide. So turn one. Turn one, you're going to really just lift on throttle, and you'll see that I don't really fully come off the throttle at all for any length of time, but you'll see how much lift is needed. So that's going to obviously vary based on how the car feels, weather, fuel, and so forth. One other thing I want to point out is there are 3 spots on this track where the car can and will take damage. And the setup for qualifying differs quite a bit from race setup, because the damage that can occur to the car in these 3 spots at the track, it will affect your time just maybe a slight amount, but not enough to affect the way that I would run the car in setup. And so the springs are softer. In the race setup, the springs are stiffened all the way up to help minimize that damage. You can lose, I think, roughly a half a second per lap, maybe more, maybe up to a full second, depending on how much damage you take in these sections of the track. We found that early on last season, and Tapani made the suggestion of running fully stiff springs, which is what I've done here and which helped greatly. And I'm going to show you an example of some cars that took damage. Turn 1 is the first place that you can take damage. Downhill out of turn 2, damage can occur if you run right here. You'll see the car takes a little bit of a bounce. Damage can occur there. So if you run just a wider line on your out lap, that can minimize the chance of damage there. And the third spot for damage, and this is the worst, is, oh wow, what did I just hit there? Okay, so the third spot for damage is right here. The downhill down into Moss Corner. And this is where it happens most frequently. You can see the car takes a little bit of a bounce right through here. You can try running a wider line or an even more narrow line. It doesn't really seem to matter. Damage inevitably will occur, but it is far less frequent and far less severe if you are running the stiffer springs. So, and I'll show some examples of what that looks like for some of the other cars that took damage throughout the race here. So let's go back to turn 1 again. And a couple of things to be thinking about here is when you start to lift, roughly around the dirt patch here. And what you're trying to do is just keep it close to the curbing to the right. You don't need to go up on it or over it. You can. I think if you do, you probably increase the likelihood of damage because the car will take a little bit more of a heavier bounce if you do that. You can see I just barely clip the end of the curbing there. And back to full throttle right at about this point. So as you reach the curbing to the right, you want to be back to full throttle. You may lift again briefly to avoid running wide on the exit of the corner. Now, in this case, if I feel like I'm not going to run wide and I can keep it full throttle, that's ideal. You want to run full throttle here all the way through here if you can. This is where you're going to kind of have a feel if you're going to run a little wide. Just lift a little bit to avoid going up into the grass, but you can use all of the curbing here on corner exit. So on the downhill, this is a tricky corner because the car can really lighten up coming down the corner here, but you still want to stay on throttle because what you're actually doing is creating as much downforce as you can. Even though this is a 7-wing track, potentially 6-wing, but it becomes very, very difficult to run consistently at 6-wing. And there are a lot of flat out sections of this track, so it is going to be a little bit more of a mid downforce setup. But I found 7-wing to be more consistent and still very quick. And so both my qualifying and race setups are with 6-wing. But because it's a 7-wing setup, you've got a little less downforce, and as you come down off this corner, the car can get loose. But you've got to trust that the downforce you're creating with the speed that you're carrying is going to give you enough downforce to keep from spinning. If you kind of chicken out and take your foot off the throttle here, right about this point, as you're coming down this hill, you feel like you're going too fast and you're not going to make the corner. If you just abruptly lift on the throttle, the car is going to come around on you. So you've got to trust that you're taking the right line and running enough speed here that you're going to keep generating enough downforce to keep the tires down pinned down to the track. So the point where you're going to begin to lift, I like to keep it close to the right here, and then just as I'm approaching the crest here before the downhill, a little bit of a lift to get the car turned in. And I like to aim to get really as close to the left as I can. You don't have to get all the way over, but as you lift and as you turn in, you're going to want to now begin to think about getting back to throttle actually. And not fully lifting off, just keeping a little bit of throttle all the way through. And now as you've kind of crossed that little bump here, which is where the damage can occur, by the way, this is where you're now getting back to full throttle increasingly. And now full throttle all the way through at this point. So you can see where the car's at. It's about the middle of the road here at this point, and still turning in to try to use the left-hand side of the track here as much as you can, because as you're carrying full throttle through here, it's better to really keep it as tight to the left as you can. As you come to the exit over to the curb here, you may have to lift if you didn't quite run a tight enough line. So I actually gave myself quite a bit of space. There is a fair amount of space, and oftentimes I'll use this curbing here. In this case, I didn't need to. And you can see that the car is full throttle from this point all the way on out. And so as long as you're not getting too wide to the left, and then as you're coming through this apex section right here, pretty tight. At least that tight. I mean, honestly, there's a lot of room to spare. You're going to make it through the corner just fine. So coming up to this corner here, this is a downshift into third. So braking is going to start just before the darker shade of asphalt there. There isn't a real clear braking marker. Now maybe as your vision reaches the end of this, of course that'll depend on your field of view, but in this case this is where I'm starting to brake. Pretty hard braking. At least 60 up to 70% braking I think is what you'll want to have here. And then there's the downshift, blip, downshift into third. Treat this as a bit of a late apex and try not to apex too soon, and definitely try not to touch this curbing because it'll definitely throw the car off quite a bit. So here's your apex right here toward the latter part of the curbing. So getting as close to that as you can. This is real key to keeping the car close to this edge. This is where you're going to be getting back to throttle. There might be a bit of trail braking to make sure you can reach that apex there. It feels a bit off camber here as you come around this apex and get back to throttle, and so keeping it real tight here is real important to make sure that you can get back to throttle as soon as you can. And if you don't, you're going to sacrifice a lot of speed on the corner exit here to make sure that you don't run off into the grass, and the car can tend to slide and run wide here, and so not keeping it tight there to the apex will cost quite a bit of speed because you want to get back to full throttle really quickly here. So there's the full throttle point on exit, and we're going to be full throttle all the way down to Moss Corner. You don't need all of the road here, so you can see I'm not really taking a wide entry. Starting from about the little bit to the right here, a little bit right of center, and then coming down to this section of the track on the inside. Now, I tend to run pretty tight on the left here, and this is the point where, the third point where you can take damage. I'm pretty sure I didn't take any damage on this. Let's see here. Yeah. But I'll show some examples of where some damage can occur there. Now, I haven't done a whole lot of laps to really analyze this as far as the path. There were some experimental lines taken through here to try to avoid this damage. One was to take just a nice real wide line and then come back in, but it looked like damage could still occur there. I found that if I kept it really tight, it seemed to occur just a little less often than if I was further to the right on this dark patch of asphalt. So if the car is centered over this patch of asphalt, it did seem to occur slightly more often than if it was tighter to the left. So no, I don't have any definitive data to show that, but this was the line that I began to run for last season, that I will continue to run, because I like keeping it tight to the left here to get to your braking zone, which again is tight to the left on this section of track. And so that's the line that I would recommend running there, just keeping it kind of tight to the left there. Now, as I mentioned, this is softer springs in the race setup, and the fact that the damage did not occur here maybe is further evidence that it's less likely to occur, but it's a game of chance, really, whether or not the damage will occur here. Okay, so braking. Getting on the brakes already, just kind of as you reach the base of the hill here. Threshold brake is going to be a little bit further up, about 80%. Pretty hard continuous braking here. Car's going pretty fast on a downhill, and you want to get all of your braking done to the point of where you're going to be turning in with just a little bit of trail braking. And I don't like to run too tight to the curbing here to the right. I actually like to run with a few feet of spacing off of this curb, because I found that if I'm running too tight to this curbing, it's a little harder to get the car rotated quickly enough to get back on throttle for the exit. And this was, I think, the most important corner on the track. It's the most important because it's before the longest straight on an uphill, and it's the most difficult corner to hit consistently. And so this is, I think, the corner where you'll want the most practice and finding consistency with this line, and the technique of getting the car around this corner by carrying the most amount of speed and getting back to throttle at the point that I'll show here. So coming into the corner here, you can see leaving a bit of space here, and starting to just tap the brakes at this point, and you're going to be doing more often. I think it's more likely that you're going to do a little bit of trail braking to help make sure the car can rotate throughout this corner. And so you'll see a fair amount of braking, tapping the brakes to help get the car rotated. And your vision at this point should be focused on this apex here. This is where you want to get back to throttle. Now, I like to run close to it. You don't have to get right up onto that, and you definitely don't want it so close that you run the risk of hitting this curb. This curb can be a lot of trouble, so don't touch it. But you can run actually a little wide, and this darker patch of asphalt is maybe even a better reference for the line of where you want to run the car, and aiming to get back to full throttle right about this point here. Or not back to full throttle, sorry, getting back on throttle by that point. So you can see I'm starting to already get on the throttle just a little bit before that. 30, 40, 50, 60%, and now full throttle by reaching that curbing there. So, and you'll see the car actually does follow from this point forward that patch of asphalt pretty closely. So that's a good line to follow, and it also demonstrates that you really don't have to get too close. It's fairly close at this point, but again, it's right along that patch of asphalt. You can get closer, but it's not necessary to get right up next to the curbing there to run the faster line out of the corner. Really, the point is to be getting back on throttle as soon as you possibly can. And so this is a real nice early throttle. And if you're focused on getting about 50, 60% throttle at this point, and then getting back to full throttle by the time you reach this curbing, you're going to have a nice quick exit here. This is also your best passing zone on the track. And so at the end of this video, I'll show a bonus clip of a 3-lap battle between Tipani and myself, and you'll see that this is the best opportunity to close the gap with the draft and also make the pass toward the end of the straight, or at least get alongside toward the end of the straight. And so I'll show that clip here at the end of this video to show that that 3-lap battle that we had in our race. So going back through this at speed now. All right, so full throttle all the way through this section of the track. And all right, so approaching this corner, it's really just a throttle lift. There shouldn't be any braking needed. Starting to come off throttle again just as you start to turn in. So that can be right at about, let's see here, the fence. Right about where the fence begins there is a good point. So starting to get off throttle just a little bit. And again, you can actually get through here without getting off throttle, fully off throttle at all. I think I probably come off it fully here at one point, and actually did a tiny bit of braking even. So I was worried about running too wide. The focus is to get to this curbing as your apex right here on the right, so you can barely start to see that. And you can use it, you can get up onto that, you don't need to. I like to just get to the point where I can hear the tires touching that curbing there. And again, keeping a bit of throttle all the way through this corner. And downshiifting into third. There's the blip down into third. Braking is real quick and light, 30% or so. And getting it nice and snug to this curbing, and sacrificing that exit a little bit because you want to get as close to the line as you can here. Now, you can see that you're not going to get all the way up to that line, but the focus should be getting the car to the left as far as you can so that you can carry more speed through the final corner. So, and there's actually going to be, between these two corners, a little bit of throttle, about halfway, and then now getting on brakes just a bit, real tap, 20-30% brake maybe, getting back on throttle just a little. Again, just I'm actually modulating brake and throttle a bit to kind of balance the car out. Try to get the car as close to this curbing as you can, because again, this is the point where you want to be getting back on throttle. As you reach that curbing, there's the apex, back on throttle, and then gradually reaching full throttle by the time you reach the curbing on corner exit. So there we are, full throttle on corner exit. You can come all the way up over and use the asphalt on the other side of this curbing. So you can use all of that. You can even briefly touch the dirt here without an off track. It's not any faster, but if you happen to run a little wide and touch that dirt, then you can do so without an off track. Okay, so that's the lap. So let's look at damage real quickly here. And I'm going to pick on Travis because I saw some examples. Now, I saw Travis from several people. I'm sorry, damage taken by several people in this race, but I made note of some spots here. Almost every car took damage. I think that Tapani and myself actually took the least amount of damage. I know we were both running the stiffer springs, and I think that did help. And I think that really mainly applies to the latter half of the race. So let's go to the race and let's look at the 3 points where damage can occur, so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so this is the first example, and this is always the most severe. This is the third point that I mentioned there, and you can see damage occurring right there. And it's not real significant yet, but later on in the race, as you take additional damage here, it will affect the downforce of the car. So that will build up, and like I say, later in the race, I think it can cost you about a half a second or more, maybe up to a full second, depending on the severity of the damage that you take there. And you're going to be losing time on the straights. And of course, losing time on the straights where you've got your passing zone on the uphill straight, it's going to make it real easy for someone to get around you and complete the pass. You're going to be quite a bit slower there on the straight without that downforce that's lost. So there's the first example there. Now if we go up to lap 5, there's the second example. So this is the point, as I mentioned earlier on, where you could actually maybe avoid possible damage there in your out lap to qualifying. So you can see if you're running real close to the curbing here, this is right where the damage occurred. So maybe just run a little wider there on your out lap could save you a few hundredths, or I don't know, probably 5/100ths of a second or something like that. I don't know, but it could cost you a little bit in your qualifying laps. And the next example was here on lap 11, where I believe damage was taken again for the second time in this sector, and you can see where it becomes much more severe right there. So, and this is where I think at this point it's going to definitely start to affect your time. It's going to be more noticeable at that point, and how that affects the handling of the car, how that affects your top straight line speed. I think you'll notice that if you're taking that amount of damage, and I think it could even get even more severe from this point, and may not even be visually represented, but it does feel like the time falls off later on in the race. And so anyway, there's a quick look at damage. Okay, so just making sure there wasn't any other notes there. So here's the bonus footage at the end of the race here. Pull that up. 3-lap battle here. So what you'll see here is I make a mistake coming out of the downhill on turn 2 on an Audi, where I lose a lot of speed. Tapani's going to close right up on me, and we have a nice little 3-lap battle. So we'll follow that out for the rest of the video. Talk to you later.